In many disinvested neighborhoods, decades of poverty, segregation, and limited financial literacy programs created survival economies. Street organizations arose, often mixing protection, identity, and illicit markets when formal opportunity collapsed. Case study: Chicago's South and West Sides during factory closures and housing segregation. As jobs vanished and formal credit froze, neighborhood identity and informal safety nets formed. We'll first examine the systems that created scarcity, then later, how some groups emerged within it. In capital-starved areas, underground cash often looked like opportunity. Without assets, credit, or guidance, quick money was mistaken for wealth, risk rose, and incarceration followed. Hold that thought. We'll return to who organized inside this vacuum after we map the causes. On the West Coast, Los Angeles faced school segregation, job scarcity, and housing discrimination. Neighborhood crews evolved as responses to exclusion and insecurity. We'll first build the timeline of policy and economics that made those responses feel necessary. Inside prisons, carceral networks replaced community institutions, reinforcing cycles that prioritize survival over entrepreneurship and education. Keep this in mind as we connect how policy, poverty, and limited financial knowledge set the stage. Across America, scarce financial education compounded the damage. Without banking access, credit building, or asset strategies, short-term hustles beat long-term compounding, turning neighborhoods into cash deserts instead of equity engines. Later, we'll examine who organized within this landscape. Evidence-based solutions exist. Rebuild safe capital access, expand youth financial literacy, seed small business credit, and repair housing barriers, so organizations born of scarcity lose their recruiting power. Welcome to Big Talk TV News. I'm your host, Edward Wooten. Why do some families seem to build wealth generation after generation, while others struggle just to gain financial footing? Is it effort? Is it opportunity? Or is the answer buried deep in the history of this nation? Because when you examine the facts, you discover something powerful. The economic race in America did not begin with everyone at the same starting line. To understand the present and the deep-seated economic disparities that persist today, we must first confront the past. It's a journey not into a forgotten history, but into the very foundation of the American economic system, a system whose initial blueprints were drawn with lines of profound inequality. This history is not distant, but one whose economic architecture continues to cast a long and complex shadow over the financial landscape for Black Americans. The echoes of these foundational decisions reverberate in our modern world, shaping opportunities, perceptions, and the distribution of wealth in ways we are only now beginning to fully comprehend. For nearly 2.5 centuries, from the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in 1619 until the formal abolition of slavery in 1865, a system of forced labor was woven into the very fabric of the American economy. This wasn't a peripheral aspect of the nation's development. It was a central, driving force, meticulously constructed and legally reinforced over 10 generations. This was the era of chattel slavery, a brutal and explicit legal framework that systematically stripped millions of people of their humanity, their heritage, and their future. During that time, they were legally classified as property, or chattel, not as people, and certainly not as workers with rights. They were assets, listed in ledgers alongside livestock and land to be bought, sold, and inherited. This classification was absolute, denying them any legal standing or personal autonomy. The very concept of justice was inverted. The law existed not to protect the individual, but to protect the property rights of the enslaver. The law was not a protector, it was an enforcer of this system. Enslaved people were forbidden by law to own land, accumulate wealth, or operate businesses. They could not enter into contracts. Their families could be torn apart at a moment's notice, and any meager possessions they had could be taken away. Laws known as slave codes strictly controlled every aspect of their existence, prohibiting education and assembly, creating a state of perpetual vulnerability enforced by both legal bodies and vigilante patrols. Yet their unpaid, backbreaking labor was the engine that helped build one of the fastest-growing economies in the world. From the tobacco fields of Virginia to the cotton plantations of the Deep South, their forced productivity generated immense fortunes and fueled America's industrial revolution. This labor built ports, laid railroad tracks, and produced the raw materials, especially cotton, that powered textile mills in the North and in Europe. But the wealth produced from that labor, the foundation of countless family dynasties and corporate empires, did not belong to them. This value wasn't just captured by plantation owners. It flowed through the entire economic ecosystem, enriching bankers who issued mortgages on enslaved people, insurance companies that underwrote their lives as property, and merchants who traded the goods they produced. It was systematically extracted, creating a zero-sum economic reality. For generations, Black Americans were legally barred from the most fundamental tenet of economic mobility, the ability to build and pass on wealth. This wasn't just a lack of opportunity, it was the legislated prevention of it, a historical head start of zero that echoes to this day. While one group was building multi-generational fortunes on a foundation of free labor, another was trapped at a starting line they were forbidden by law to leave. This is the undeniable origin point of the racial wealth gap. To understand the deep structural roots of the racial wealth gap, we must travel back to the 19th century, a time when a single commodity dictated the fortunes of a nation. In the 1800s, cotton, aptly named King Cotton, became America's most valuable export. This wasn't by accident. The Industrial Revolution in Britain had created a voracious, insatiable demand for raw textiles, and the American South, with its vast tracts of land and a system of forced labor, was uniquely positioned to meet it. This raw material, harvested by hand, would fuel the nation's explosive growth and fundamentally shape its economic destiny. By 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, the United States was producing nearly two-thirds of the entire world's supply of cotton. This wasn't just a Southern phenomenon. It was the powerful engine of the national economy. The value of this single export was staggering, dwarfing all other American products combined. But the true grim valuation lay not in the cotton itself, but in the people forced to cultivate it. Historians estimate that the nearly 4 million enslaved people in the U.S. were worth more than all of the nation's factories and railroads combined. Their forced labor was the capital that built modern America, and nearly all of that staggering production depended on this brutal, dehumanizing system of enslaved labor. The economic web it spun was vast, intricate, and disturbingly national in scope. Northern banks in financial centers like New York and Philadelphia provided the mortgages for Southern plantations and the credit needed to purchase more enslaved people. Insurance companies in cities like Hartford and Aetna wrote policies on enslaved people, treating human lives as property to be protected against loss. The shipping industries in Boston and New York grew wealthy, transporting the cotton, and the textile factories across New England spun it into cloth, employing thousands. From Wall Street financiers to the factory floor, entire sectors of the American economy grew directly from the profits of slavery. But when slavery finally ended in 1865, this economic engine, built on human bondage, shuddered to a halt. The system that had built so much wealth for the nation had systematically and legally prevented Black Americans from building any for themselves. The foundation of their economic exclusion was now complete. For 246 years they were legally barred from owning property, earning wages, or accumulating any assets. Their families were torn apart, their labor was stolen, and their very bodies were commodified, bought, and sold. Every hour of their work, every crop they harvested, generated wealth that was immediately transferred to their enslavers and the wider economic system that supported them. With the stroke of a pen, 4 million people were granted their freedom, but they were left with absolutely nothing. No land, no money, no tools. Not even the clothes on their backs were truly their own. They were expected to survive and even thrive in a nation where they had been denied the ability to build wealth for generations. It was a start from far, far behind zero. Freedom had arrived, a monumental victory for human rights. But financial opportunity, the very foundation of the American dream, had not. This was not just an economic disadvantage, it was the beginning of a multi-generational wealth chasm, a starting line deliberately placed centuries behind everyone else. In the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, as the smoke cleared and the nation grappled with the monumental task of reconstruction, a powerful and urgent discussion emerged. The central question was not just philosophical, but deeply practical: how to integrate 4 million newly freed people into the fabric of American society. These were individuals who had been systematically denied every right, every opportunity, and every ounce of their own labor. Out of this complex debate came a promise of restorative justice, a chance to begin rectifying centuries of forced, unpaid labor. It was a recognition that freedom without economic means was a hollow victory. There was a tangible plan for providing formerly enslaved families with the one thing they needed most to build a future: land. This wasn't just a vague idea or a political platitude. It was codified in Union General William T. Sherman's Special Field Order No. 15, issued in January 1865. The order was a direct result of Sherman's meeting with black leaders in Savannah, Georgia, who articulated that land ownership was the key to true freedom. The order confiscated a vast 30-mile-wide tract of coastal land stretching 245 miles from Charleston, South Carolina, down to the St. Johns River in Florida, 400,000 acres in total, from Confederate landowners. This land was explicitly designated for settlement by black families in 40-acre parcels. The phrase that captured the nation's imagination and has echoed through history became known as 40 acres and a mule. While the mule was a later addition to the popular understanding, it symbolized the practical reality of the plan. It wasn't just about owning a plot of earth. It was about having the necessary tools and resources to work it, to make it productive. The mule represented the capital, the equipment, the means to turn soil into sustenance and profit. But the core promise, the foundation of it all, was the land itself. The idea was simple, yet revolutionary. Give land to freed families so they could build independent wealth, cultivate their own food, and support themselves outside the oppressive systems of the past. It was a direct pathway to economic autonomy, a chance to escape the sharecropping system that would soon trap so many in a cycle of debt peonage. It was a route to full citizenship, where property ownership was tied to political power and social standing. For a brief, hopeful moment, it seemed like a new dawn was truly breaking. But the policy was never widely or fully carried out. The window of opportunity was tragically short. Following President Lincoln's assassination in April 1865, his successor, Andrew Johnson, a Tennessee native and a sympathizer to the Southern cause, swiftly reversed the order. He issued proclamations of amnesty and pardon for former Confederate landowners, restoring their property rights. This act of political reconciliation with the white South came at the direct expense of the newly freed black population, displacing the thousands of families who had already begun to settle and farm their new plots with the government's blessing. The promise was broken. The dream was rescinded. For the approximately 40,000 people who had started new lives on this land, the reversal was a brutal eviction. Most freed families received nothing: no land, no financial compensation for their stolen labor, no economic head start. This single policy reversal was not just a disappointment, it was a catastrophic failure of political will with devastating, long-term consequences. It effectively slammed the door on the most straightforward path to Black economic self-sufficiency in the 19th century, a path that could have altered the nation's destiny. And so, millions of Americans began their new freedom at an economic ground zero, with absolutely no generational wealth to build upon or pass down. This wasn't just a missed opportunity. It was the active creation of a structural disadvantage that locked poverty into place. It was a foundational moment that would shape economic disparity for more than a century to come, creating a wealth gap that persists to this very day. The story of 40 acres and a mule is not just a historical footnote. It is the origin story of an economic divide that continues to define the American landscape. Fast forward to the 1930s. During the Great Depression, the U.S. government created programs designed to help Americans purchase homes. One agency, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, created maps used by banks to decide where mortgage loans would be approved. Neighborhoods were graded by financial risk. Green meant safe, yellow meant caution. But many neighborhoods where Black Americans lived were marked in red. This practice became known as redlining. Banks often refused mortgage loans in red-line neighborhoods, which meant families living there struggled to buy homes. At the very same time, millions of white families were purchasing homes in new suburban developments across the country. Those homes gained value over time, and that value created something powerful: equity. Equity in a home can be used to fund college education, start a business, or provide financial stability during hard times. It can also be passed down to children and grandchildren. That is what economists call generational wealth. But when families are blocked from home ownership, they miss out on the single largest wealth-building tool in America. Instead of building equity, many families were forced to rent for decades. And rent payments build no ownership. The effects of these policies did not disappear overnight. In fact, many communities that were redlined decades ago still face economic challenges today. Because wealth doesn't just appear overnight, it is built slowly, generation by generation. When opportunity is blocked for decades, many Black families were funneled into underfunded public housing projects, concentrating poverty. Concentrated poverty correlates with higher crime rates, another legacy of discriminatory housing policy. With that foundation laid, policy, redlining, disinvestment, and financial exclusion, let's turn to who organized within the vacuum. In cities where public and private investment dried up, informal power structures filled gaps in safety, income, and identity. Some coalesced into street organizations, part protection, part economy, shaped by the scarcity around them. Researchers trace their rise to concentrated poverty, blocked credit, and limited financial literacy opportunities. Chicago's South Side saw networks form amid deep segregation and job loss. Chicago's South Side, jobs vanished, blocks divided. Black Pea Stone Nation, founded by Jeff Fort and Eugene Bull Hairston, claimed order where the city didn't. Also, Chicago, the gangster disciples, Larry Hoover and David Barksdale, built structure amid segregation, layoffs, and shrinking public investment. Los Angeles was a powder keg, schools segregated, jobs fleeing, policing hard. Out of that pressure, the Crips emerged, founded by Raymond Washington and Stanley Tookie Williams. Blue flags, tight discipline. Their rise sparked a counter-move on Peru Street. Sylvester Scott and Benson Owens organized what became the Bloods. Red Rag, their own code, their own map of survival. Inside prisons, the Black Guerrilla family formed, founded by George Jackson and W.L. Nolan, reflecting carceral realities. These groups mixed protection, identity, and underground income when formal opportunity collapsed, outcomes of policy barriers and missing financial pathways. Decades of redlining and disinvestment left many neighborhoods with fewer banks and more high-cost lenders. Without access to fair credit or basic financial education, families were more vulnerable to predatory loans and fast cash schemes. In that vacuum, street organizations often positioned themselves as problem solvers, enforcing their own rules, mediating disputes, and circulating money sometimes through illicit markets. It's a cycle. Low opportunity narrows choices. Disinvestment erodes trust. The lack of financial literacy compounds risk. At the same time, community responses took root. Block clubs, church coalitions, youth outreach groups pushing back with mentorship, financial workshops, and violence interruption. The through line is structural. Where policy and investment fall short, alternative institutions, formal and informal, fill the gap. The outcomes, however, diverge sharply, shaping safety, wealth, and stability for generations. Understanding history is not about blame. It is about understanding the systems that shaped our present. Because when you understand where the starting line was placed, you begin to understand the race itself. This has been a Big Talk TV News Special Report. I'm Edward Wooten. And when we examine the facts, the truth always tells a powerful story. Thank you for watching, and good night.